The reason why I'm not doing the can Islam tolerate liberalism question is that that's the question that we hear again and again and again every night on the news, and the Americans administering Iraq and the Israelis sorting out the Palestinians. It's the great question of the day. Very seldom, however, do we look at things the other way round, which is what I'm going to try and do this evening. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In a sense, the question could be, do you have to be liberal in order properly to belong to the West? For all of the polite multiculturalist denials, the question is being put to us more and more insistently. The European Union, for instance, as it seeks to articulate a common cultural as well as economic vision, regularly toys with all kinds of grand statements about Europe as a vision of human community whose success underpins the universal model which is now being urged upon the rest of humanity. European liberals, with their Enlightenment, civil society, democratic institutions and human rights codes, sometimes almost seem to self-define as a kind of secular messiah, willing and ready to save the world. To resist, by implication, is to align oneself with an unregenerate and sinful humanity. However, things are not quite that simple, because we Europeans are at the moment in the middle of a difficult argument. We're constantly quarrelling with ourselves over what it is to be European and to belong. We're good at uniting to build an Airbus, for instance, but we're not nearly so good at uniting around a shared moral or cultural ideal. What, after all, are the historic grounds for European cultural unity? And now, and this seems to be the great question across Europe, how can Muslims fit into this poorly defined liberal identity which Europe associates with itself? Possibly it helps if we turn the clock right back and look at Europe's origins, its mythical roots. It's in Homer, very long ago, when we learned that Europa, the daughter of the king of Phoenicia, was abducted by Zeus, duly ravished, and borne off to the island of Crete, where she gave birth to the Europeans. There seems to be something emblematic and transgressive about this founding myth. A Lebanese maiden torn from the breast of Asia and deposited in the corner of the continent which eventually bore her name. The beginning of our story is, in fact, a violent European raid upon Asia and a kind of confiscation of identity. Possibly we can go back that far, and Europe's literature, in fact, does begin with Homer. Europe's ambiguity about itself and its values. But Europa only finds herself and discovers the limits of her soul and body long after this classical mythic prologue. For the Romans, it wasn't Europe at all, it was the Mediterranean which defined the core of their terrain and their commercial and religious life. Rome equally embraced the European, African and Asian shores of the Middle Sea. But while it saw itself as superior, it never sought to impose its philosophy or religion or social values on others. So I think we have to hesitate before accepting the common cliche heard amongst Muslims, I think in particular, that in our time what we're seeing is a little rerun of ancient history. America is Rome, Europe is Athens, and Islam is a kind of endlessly troublesome Judea. Ancient Rome and Athens never in fact tried to universalize their values, even within the bounds of their political authority. Still less did they think it was their mission to encourage the whole world to accept their social beliefs. In the 7th century, Islam appears, and the Asian and African shores are lost. Europe is thrown back on its own resources and seeks to define itself, then as now, ultimately as the prolongation of the rather small remnant of the classical story that the Saracens missed. And from that time on, it developed ideas of itself as being possessed of a unique and universal social rightness. The historian Fernand Braudel insists that it was the choc électrique, the electric shock of the Battle of Poitiers, 732, when the Arab and Berber advance into France was finally stemmed, which gave the Franks, and hence the Europeans, their sense of self. Charlemagne's capital of Aachen seemed symbolically to straddle both banks of the Rhine, making a nonsense of the old Roman border. The German barbarians who brought down Rome and who now ruled in France and Germany as they had ruled in Italy and Spain now claimed to be heirs of the imperium. The almost obsessive cult of the Latin language and classical mythology, which characterized European education until well into the 20th century, shows how anxious the Germanic peoples were to see themselves, rather than Saracens, who now controlled most of what was the Roman Empire, heirs to the Roman story. In 1453, when the Ottomans capture and sack the Eastern Rome, Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II claims the title of Roman Emperor, but no monarch in Europe ever refers to him in those terms. Rather, as the Bible rejects Ishmael in favour of Isaac, so Europe has been united in nothing so much as its rejection of Islam's claims to be the legitimate inheritor of the blessings bestowed by antiquity and by those other patriarchs, Plato and Aristotle. As a matter of fact, and this is something that's, I think, still not adequately noted by liberal advocates of European uniqueness, Islam was for much of its history the principal heir of Athens, geographically and intellectually. But Europe still finds it hard to see Islam as the rightful or a rightful inheritor of Athens, any more than it has found it easy to see that Ishmael has legitimate authority over Jerusalem. And the reason for this was Christianity. Christian monks saw themselves as the true interpreters of Hellenism, despite all of their borrowings from other sources, particularly Islamic ones. Rome, the only remaining Christian city of the classical world, was assumed to be the inheritor of that world's riches, which had moved west rather than stayed put in places like Antioch and Alexandria. The Saracen was always going to be an interloper, an upstart. Thanks to the same furor Teutonicus which baffled and brought down Rome, the Franks managed to keep the false inheritors at bay, and even during the Crusades found themselves united as Europeans in a counterattack that once again brought Jerusalem into Christian hands. From that time until the present, Europe and its children in the ethnically cleansed Americas has been sure of its proper possession not only of ancient Semitic prophecy, but also of the legacy of Athens with which it coexisted in such a complex and often unstable marriage. Now there's an older sort of Orientalism which still claims that Islam, as the major Semitism, if you like, sniffed briefly at Greece but then turned away from it. This is the old idea of Al-Ghazali sounding the death knell of Greek philosophy in the world of Islam. Hellenism, according to the likes of Leo Strauss, could only find room at the European inn. Islam, with its burden of scriptural literalism, treated it as a resident alien at best. And that applies not only to metaphysics, but to political theory as well. Plato has a brief Muslim apotheosis on the pages of Al-Farabi, but after that, we're told, darkness descends. And Leo Strauss, the chief purveyor of this theory, has, of course, many admirers, and some of them have gone on to leave their mark upon the world. Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz amongst the most convinced Straussians. Also, Pope Benedict's famous, very controversial lecture in Regensburg 3 years ago likewise seemed to present the Muslims as improper heirs to the classical legacy of rationality and rights, which he thinks is Europe's alone. However, the best recent scholarship seems to have blown this apart. We're now more likely to see people like, and Muslims at least will recognise these names, Juwayni, Ghazali, Razi, as the great advocates of a selective, it's true, but profound internalizing of Greek reason. Greek ethics lives on very powerfully in the pages of texts that are still studied across the Muslim world to this day. You think of Miskawayh, Raghavil, Isfahani, and Ghazali himself. Political thought, particularly in terms of the constitution of rights in society, the old themes of Athens also lived on in the standard manuals of statecraft that were popular amongst medieval Muslim princes, whether in the Ottoman, Safavid or Mughal domains. And if Plato was in fact modified quite drastically by the Sira, that's probably no bad thing, since Plato has so often been not a friend but an enemy of open societies. The internalising of ancient philosophy, including those strands from which modern liberal thinking ultimately claims to take its origin, did happen differently in Islam and the Western world. That's one reason why Athens in Europe eventually defeated Jerusalem, and philosophy of an increasingly secular bent defeated theology. Aquinas, whose great text, the Summa contra Gentiles, was actually written to help secure Christian theology in lands reconquered from Muslims, proposed a symbiosis of philosophy and scripture, which for most Europeans now has utterly outlived its credibility. The same Christian interval in Europe, which laid claim to the classical age by virtue, strangely perhaps, of the overlaps visible in the Greek New Testament, has faltered to be replaced by a range of vibrant paganisms, or an often militant official secularity. We're seeing a new class of triumphalist atheists, Dawkins, Grayling, and others, who assail faith for its inability to deliver a peaceful and just society. In fact, ethical liberal arguments against religion are now much more commonly heard than an older sort of objection to faith grounded in, for instance, the problem of evil or the improbability of the book of Genesis. Probably this began in the late 19th century in the context of the struggle against Catholicism, when all reasonable people seemed to oppose Pope Pius IX when he issued his famous Syllabus of Errors, which anathematized the Enlightenment notions of religious freedom and the separation of church from state. Article 80 of the syllabus proclaims, for instance, one may be excommunicated if one holds that the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. Since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, anathemas like that have become pretty hard to imagine. And even the Vatican now is reinventing itself as an advocate of precisely the liberal opinions, or at least many of them, which a century ago would have resulted in withholding of the sacrament. Its opposition to the death penalty, its support for religious freedom are two iconic examples. In fact, liberalism's triumph in our continent seems so complete that many today can hardly recall the old and fierce Christian opposition to it. Thanks to such capitulations, the Europe that historically made itself a unit by keeping Muslims at bay or by expelling them in Spain, France, Sicily and the Balkans, has now substantially let go of the distinctiveness of the religious vision of society that allowed that to happen. Liberalism, whose very complex, crooked genealogy stretches back to distant issues raised in ancient Athens, and whose biblical tributaries, claimed by some Americans, are perhaps only imaginary, has replaced the older theocratic thinking, which perhaps lingers on, but only in a few distinctly eccentric royalist and right-wing circles. Secularity is largely the invention of the continent which was the cradle of Christian monarchism. Today, indeed, in a world where there may be secularism abroad, but not much secularity, it's almost a European monopoly. God's continent has been transformed into the crucible of an increasingly assertive materialism. Partly for this reason, as the desk pilots in Brussels think ahead, they know that future expansion of the Union must always be to the east and never to the south. The Drang nach Osten of Euroland may within 30 years bring Europe, intelligibly enough, to Vladivostok, but Tangiers, which is only 20 miles away across the sea, which in classical times was a thoroughfare rather than a barrier, is generally admitted to be psychologically much further away. Hence we find that today, as regularly in the Christian past, Europe's arguments about itself, whether right-wing or libertarian, usually end in terms of its relationship with its significant other, now as then the Saracenic or the Turkish realm. Following Europe's breaking of its own bounds after the great geographical discoveries, the Islamic world was progressively made to submit to European patterns of government and economic interest. Today, the elites in the post-colonial Muslim world are substantially Europeans themselves, rather than adherents of local values. Sometimes their fervent dislike of the indigenous makes them seem more royal than the king. With such converts, Brussels has no significant quarrel, although it regularly agonises over the corruption and often the cruelty of the westernised classes in the former colonies. Hence, for instance, our paradoxical support for the Palestinian Authority, even though it was Hamas that was elected, one of the paradoxes that we wrestle with. The elites, of course, are expected to conform to constitutional norms as well as the secular forms of Europe. Sometimes we, liberals in particular, have to choose between the two. You choose between the results of an election, or you choose between something that seems more palatable to liberalism. But as the Eurocrat is nervously aware, those elites often seem to resemble a kind of fragile skin stretched over a huge sea of difference. The Muslim world, possibly even the non-Western world, can sometimes look like a geologist's model of the Earth. Not far down, the planet is alive and moving, a mass of liquid magma. But on the surface, there are plates of congealed rock which uneasily coexist. Tensions between Morocco and Algeria, for instance, are tensions between the cold Europeanized classes, not the often passionately religious populations beneath, for whom the boundaries drawn by past generations of colonial administrators may not make much sense. Secular elites, usually claiming liberal values, hold down a mass of illiberal religious sentiment. The holding down can sometimes be so violent that on occasion traumatized terrorists can emerge to horrify the world and in turn to confirm liberals in their uneasy support for the regimes. As they panic over demography and immigration, Europe's theorists are well aware of this. Hence the difficulty of, for instance, the current European debate over Turkey's application for membership of the European Union. The Erdogan government presents liberals with a paradox. Less secular than its predecessors, it is more committed to human rights and democratic pluralism, and is keen in particular to curb the military's projection in the political realm. The generals, with their tight-lipped laicism, claim to be the guardians of Ataturk's project to recreate Turkey in Europe's image, yet Europe has moved on. It's no longer the nationalistic, often fascistic continent that it was in the 1920s and 30s when Kemalism took shape. Hence the conundrum for the Eurocrats. Many European liberal statesmen, particularly in France and Germany, oppose Turkish membership on grounds that are clearly to do with Europe's ancient habit of self-definition as something that ultimately is not Muslim. Europe may be economically inclusive and passionately liberal and libertarian, but ultimately, to be itself, it needs to be exclusive of Muslims above all. The old crusading cry of Christians are right and pagans are wrong has been modified by replacing the word Christians with gay activists and human rights commissioners. Now, it's not impossible that in the end Turkey will be admitted, perhaps after several decades. But the current proposals which are on the table envisage Turkey's exclusion from the Amsterdam Treaty in respect of Turkey's Muslim population. In other words, if you're a European and you want to go and live in Turkey, you will have that right, but if you're a Turk and you want to go and live in Hamburg, you won't have the ability to do that. Those are the terms which are now being proposed to Ankara. And similar arrangements, it's quite likely, will be on the table when other areas of significant Muslim demography are considered for membership. Some places in the Balkans, Albania, Bosnia, possibly eventually places like Azerbaijan. So we're in an odd situation where everyone seems to be wrestling with a paradox. And the question thereby becomes quite pointed. To be Europeans, must we be liberals? Does liberal Europe's insistence when drawing its outer borders on the partial or total exclusion of Islam have implications for internal definitions of belonging? Take a look at those bland euro banknotes, which are the products of an enormous amount of think tank research in the early 90s, looking for a shared European symbol that everybody would be comfortable with on the currency. And eventually the key symbol that was chosen was the outline of the continent itself, which, if you look at it, blurs into nothingness when it approaches regions populated by Muslims. For Brussels officialdom, there is implicitly no better symbol of Europe than one which indicates non-Muslimness. That was what they could come up with. So the question is, what does a European Muslim think about himself or herself when using this currency? Does a conscious exclusion at the frontiers on religious grounds, we'll go to Vladivostok, but not Tangiers, have implications for internal solidarity and belonging? Does liberal Europe have to create an internal firewall against Muslim migrants and their battling the religious progeny? Well, despite the brave talk of European unity, the reassuring fact is that on the ground, on the national level, there is nothing resembling a consensus. There's the French model, which is rooted in Enlightenment anti-clericalism, which is absolutely exclusive of religious affiliation of any kind from its sense of belonging. That's not just about Islam. It was made clear at least 100 years ago when the Republic responded to Pius IX's syllabus of errors, the laws passed simply forbidding any priest from mentioning the papal document from the pulpit. And that established a process whereby liberal secularity could win victories over freedom of speech. And there have been recent examples of the same paradox arising. And Catholicism, though the victim of an intense anti-clericalism, was at least seen as something that was indigenous. In the Republic's more recent difficulties with its large Muslim population, there are memories of crusades and, more recently, the dirty war in Algeria, which make the exclusion of Muslim religiosity in the name of Republican laicity much easier and emphatic, and indeed, as Sarkozy has discovered, a winner at the polls. The broad-based consensus in France now that women who enter public buildings wearing the niqab should be chased out by the police is only the most recent example of this. The process will continue. It may turn out that just as Europe defines its natural boundaries as coterminous with the frontier with Islam, that its emerging definitions of citizenship and the various tests applied to those seeking citizenship will engage primarily with Islam as the significant alternative, as the model ultimately for what is seen as un-European and unacceptable. A good example is a very ponderous 76-page German document which guides officialdom in the Federal Republic in assessing applications for German citizenship. Formal citizenship tests in Germany now include questions about freedom of religion, sexual orientation, and the status of women, in order to allow officials to exclude individuals whose social beliefs are considered to conflict with the liberal mainstream. In some provinces, such as Hesse, the Muslim-specific questions are very insistent and obvious. For instance, should a woman be allowed in public without a male relative? And a question in Baden-Württemberg asks, imagine that your adult son comes to you and says he is homosexual and plans to live with another man. How do you react? Another, predictably, asks, what do you think if a man is married to two women at the same time? And again, in Germany, sport and swim classes are part of the normal school curriculum. Would you allow your daughter to participate? And the regulations give officials even the right to revoke citizenship if a very conservative religious orientation is suspected, or if a citizen's observed subsequent behaviour or opinion indicate that he or she lied when taking the test. If you're heard saying something that indicates that your real opinions were other than the boxes that you ticked when taking the test, they can remove your passport and deport you. According to Eren Unsal, who's a psychologist with something called the Turkish Union in Germany, these tests are presupposing negative and anti-Islamic. We're seeing a more restrictive immigration policy whose face is specifically anti-Muslim. Another Muslim representative even says the constitutional assumption of innocence in Germany no longer applies to Muslims. Now, these Muslim objections were generally swept aside by the mainstream press in Germany until quite recently the newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung published a leaked internal memo from the Interior Ministry sent to immigration officials. According to this document, immigration authorities should have what it calls general suspicion about the loyalty of Muslims to Germany. It goes on to explain that inner devotion to Germany should automatically be doubted in the case of Muslim applicants for citizenship. The leaked government guidelines then go on to say, Europeans, Americans and citizens of other countries who are otherwise free from suspicion should not come into contact with the test. Incidentally, another case of liberal befuddlement has been provided very recently by Satoshi Kanazawa, who complains that 81% of Muslims in Britain consider themselves Muslims first and British second, the kind of claim that's immediately picked up on Nick Griffin's website. He then builds a chauvinistic and deeply silly case for treating them with automatic suspicion. He doesn't seem to have noticed that that particular formulation is normal for religionists. The Archbishop of Canterbury says that he is Christian first and British second. But Kanazawa is a very representative example of the kind of clown who persuades believers that actually atheists are not serious. He also thinks in the same article, for instance, that most Muslims speak Arabic, which is like saying most Europeans speak English. It's on that level of ignorance that this kind of polemic appears. Anyway, back to Germany. Another example of liberal intervention is provided by the German government's attempt to create a class of Muslim religious leaders whose values conform to those of the country's liberal majority. The government set up the country's first imam training program at the University of Münster to promote this liberal agenda, but appointed as the program's director the historian Sven Kalisch, whose books claimed that the Prophet Muhammad did not even exist. Four main Muslim organizations in Germany withdrew from the program in protest, and they were criticized by the government for what it called conservative fundamentalist tendencies. In this case, eventually, the many liberals did recognize that to appoint a man who did not believe in the existence of the founder of Islam to direct the training program for the country's future imams was probably a misjudgment on the part of the authorities. As with the Muslim test, the monster experiment has generated not only resentment, but a good deal of mirth at the expense of liberal interventionists. In France, as Muslims generally know, the liberal campaign to restrict Islamic practice, sometimes supported, sometimes opposed by the right wing, has generated an interesting paradox no less informative than that supplied by bungling Germans. In 1989, a French publisher wished to bring out a French translation of Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses, and the government, of course, vigorously defended the publisher's right to do that. But less noted in the press was the fact that in 1994, the French government enforced a series of interdictions which threatened with imprisonment anyone found selling the booklets of the South African writer Ahmed Deedat. Probably most of us here have engaged with Ahmed Deedat's pamphlets at some point. At no stretch of the imagination could you regard him as being political or extreme or inciting anything at all. But, and I looked this up on the French Ministry of Justice's website a few days ago, the law of the 31st of May 1994 described his book Jesus in Islam as likely to produce des dangers pour l'ordre public because of their violently anti-Western tone and their incitement to racial hatred. So the liberals opened the doors to Salman Rushdie, closed the doors to Ahmed Deedat. Freedom of speech, it does seem, in the hands of the French establishment, operates very selectively. Now, the United Kingdom, which of course would never dream of banning Ahmed Deedat, tends to be more cautious in its attempts to encourage liberal beliefs amongst its minorities. But if you look, for instance, at the recent Ofsted assessment of the poor quality of citizenship training in faith-based secondary schools, you might get a hint of the shape of things to come. Even without the Muslims, Ofsted already has its work cut out for it. This odd thing called citizenship has been part of the national curriculum for 10 years now. And Ofsted confirms that teaching of this rather numinous subject is patchy across the board. In fact, it seems statistically that it's the worst taught subject in the nation's schools. So bad is the situation that, according to Ofsted, 1 in 10 pupils in Britain apparently do not even know what citizenship classes are, even though they've attended them. And few teenagers really engage with the issues that are raised in this kind of citizenship training. The reason seems to be general apathy towards politics and ideology current amongst many young people, possibly the result of the escapist content of mass youth entertainment. In the Muslim schools, where citizenship training is apparently in even greater disarray, Ofsted says, we must not allow recognition of diversity to become apathy in the face of any challenge to our coherence as a nation. we must be intolerant of intolerance. And that, I think, is where the official finger lies on the Achilles heel of a certain type of secular liberal ethic. If we have to be intolerant of intolerance, does that mean that liberalism cannot tolerate anything other than itself? If Europe defines citizenship in terms of adherence to a set moral template, with everything else described and perhaps punished as intolerant, how is Europe ever going to experience real difference, which more often than not is bound up with good or bad religion? One icon of this new mood of European exclusiveness was supplied in 2004. In case some of you may remember, when the European Commissioner, Rocco Buttiglione, was forced to resign when it emerged that he supported the Vatican's line on homosexuality. He insisted, to no avail, that his belief in the sinfulness of the practice would not affect the practices, the decisions he took in public life, but the consensus of European officialdom hounded him from office. The Italian Justice Minister, Roberto Castelli, objected in a futile way by calling the ban a decision which shows the real face of Europe, a face which we do not like. It's fundamentalist, and that's absolutely not on. And Muslims have watched with concern this striking proof of how categorically Europe has walked away from its traditional Christian norms and values and authorities. It's also interesting as proof that European citizenship appears to be defined in many quarters as a matter of conformity to certain sacrosanct social beliefs. In this case, the belief that conscientious opposition to homosexual practice is so wicked that those who hold such beliefs must be excluded from public office. As Buttiglione himself remarked, the new soft totalitarianism which is advancing wants to be a state religion. It is an atheistic, nihilistic religion, but it is a religion that is obligatory for all. It's quite possible that this imposition of social beliefs will become more intense as Europe secularizes, despite its apparent and difficult clash with principles of freedom of conscience. Just last month in this country, Nick Clegg, who is a Liberal Democrat leader, said that children attending faith schools should be taught that homosexuality is normal and harmless. So you raise the spectre of all of those Muslim schools in the north of England having to give special lessons to the kids in order to drive home this particular type of indoctrination. It seems reasonable to predict that the concretization of such social beliefs and their imposition through law and also media consensus is going to continue. And many will recognize in this a reversion to historic European norms, quite alien to Islam, of imposing a standard belief pattern on the king's subjects. Curious regio, eius religio. Liberalism of a particular socially prescriptive kind seems to be filling the void left by religion. And Europe, being the historic land of the divine right of kings, religion here is often more closely bound up with politics than in most pre-modern Muslim states. In this case, the condemnation of sodomy functions as a blasphemy, or what politically correct American campuses call a speech violation. Other blasphemies include, for instance, the idea that men and women are suited for different tasks, that the death penalty is a just punishment for murder, that parents may use corporal punishment to discipline their children, that unbelievers are less pleasing to God than believers, and in fact the list is quite a long one. It seems that societies hate value vacuums. After the Second World War, Europe and America went very different ways regarding truth. Europe lapsed into what the philosopher Heidegger called Gelassenheit, just letting things be, a mood which eased the eventual transition to postmodernism. America, whose heartland did not suffer RAF bombing or Nazi death camps, remained confident in a rather simple way about God and family values. But as Europe increasingly defines itself not as the splintered wreckage of war, but as a potentially mighty unit, it needs shared values. Like America, it is fixed on Islam as its significant other. But while America's foreign wars are religiously driven, Europe is preoccupied with internal cohesion, framing laws that in America would be strange, to shut the hijab out of sight, to ban minarets, to prohibit in general the public expression of conservative morality. In other words, The federal unity which in America is brought by external wars against Muslims is possible in a less jingoistic Europe only by putting Muslims at the centre of an internal war of values. Partly because of the growth in this kind of triumphalist liberalism, public intolerance of Muslims has now risen to worrying levels, and further restrictive legislation is possible in many places. And 9/11, of course, intensified this atmosphere of suspicion. In the United States, a Cornell University survey has concluded that 44% of Americans now support a selective abolition of civil rights for Muslim citizens. Some liberal and neoliberal public intellectuals, welcoming the result of this survey, have gone on record as denouncing the current American mood of regret over the very controversial concentration of Japanese Americans in camps during the Second World War. So if Europe is once again finding a kind of unity in its allergy to Muslimness, can Muslims find any allies in this apparently threatening landscape? Tariq Ramadan, in his book To Be a European Muslim, implies that a marriage is possible with environmentalist and left-wing groups who are dismayed by the rise of anti-immigrant feeling. After all, Pim Fortuyn's assassin was a militant left-wing vegetarian who wanted to defend Holland's Muslims from Fortuyn's plans for a liberal persecution. And many of the emerging British and European Muslim organisations seem to sympathise with Ramadan's approach. After all, when marching against the invasion of Iraq and now possibly Yemen and Iran, one usually finds oneself sharing an umbrella with Fabian or CND types, not with the young conservatives. Hence the popularity of people like George Galloway among Muslims. I suspect, however, that that kind of alliance is likely to be at best a very kind of tempestuous marriage of convenience. It's true that Muslims and the left may converge on Iraq or Palestine or globalization, but on domestic matters they are likely to stand at opposite poles. The Green movement and almost all on the left are fiercely pro-homosexual and feminist. It seems clear then that European Muslims are unlikely in the longer term to forge a stable relationship with the left. Similarly with the environmentalists, Muslims are often forgetful that the roots of the Green lobby in Europe are not monotheistic, but often implicitly or explicitly pagan. Nazism, for example, was very keen on the environment. Sigrid Hunke, the German feminist and Green theorist of the 1930s, who is still viewed as one of the founders of the Green movement, was revered by a good number of Nazi ideologues. Many Muslims, I think, are intuiting this correctly. But they then conclude that the true believers, almost by the nature of this wicked world, have no allies. And there are some Salafi perspectives, for instance, that seem unable to accept the possibility of any genuine partnership with non-Muslims. One recalls the embarrassing cases of Sheikh Faisal and Anwar al-Awlaki, whose followers, just mesmerized by the slogan of Quran and Sunnah, had to jump back in dismay when the views of those preachers reached the media. But that kind of isolationism seems both scripturally unnecessary and practically unwise. If Europe continues to secularize, while Europe's mosques continue to be full, and neither of those things is certain, if that does happen, then Islam is likely, without any planning or even forethought, to become the principal monotheistic energy through much of the continent, a kind of leaven in Europe's stodgy dough. And on that basis, interaction and the creation of alliances and partnerships is not a luxury but a necessity. It does help if we remember that the pressure being brought to bear on Muslim communities relates to social and not doctrinal beliefs. And sometimes Muslims in the sermonizing rhetoric tend to misunderstand this. No one in Brussels is particularly concerned about Muslim beliefs about the divine attributes or prophetic intercession. They do care about whether or not Muslims believe in feminism. And that puts Muslim believers in a historically new and rather strange position. It really ought to be possible to forge friendships with other Europeans who also have the courage to blaspheme against the Brussels magisterium. We may differ with conservative Catholics and Jews over doctrine, But doctrine is not where the battle is being fought. We're all facing very similar challenges to our social vision. Signor Bottiglione could just as easily have been a Muslim rather than a Catholic martyr. In a sense, all traditionalists are in a very similar position. And I think here there has to be a burden of responsibility shouldered by Muslim leaders. It's in our interest to seek and to hold friends. We're not alone in our conscientious rejection of a good number of liberal orthodoxies. Last week, Bishop Michel Santer of the French Church released a statement which condemns the French government's plans to punish women who wear the niqab. I think that's an important sign of the possibility of cooperation. The challenge is going to be for Muslim, Christian and Jewish conservatives to set aside their traditional hesitations about other faith communities and discover the multitude of things that they hold in common. To date, I think the enormous burgeoning interfaith industry has simply failed to capitalize on this, largely because it tends to be directed by religionists who are on the liberal end of the spectrum. It seems that we're more and more willing to discuss less and less and to conform more and more to the moral consensus of a secular world. But a kind of sacred alliance between conservative believers in different traditions would, I think, deflate in a non-sectarian and non-narrow way the potentially xenophobic and increasingly Islamophobic possibilities which are implicit in current processes of European self-definition. If Europe defines itself constitutionally, as I myself think it probably should, as either an essentially Christian entity or as one which is at least founded in belief in God, then the fact of Muslim support for core principles of Christian ethics is likely to give Islam a vital and appreciated place. But a purely secular Europe will always see Muslim values as problems on the margin to be tolerated or excluded according to the whims of the currently elected politicians. And the relationship, of course, with European Jews is no less critical. If Orthodox Jewry, which is currently the growth area in Jewish communities, can make common cause with Islam over shared moral issues, and some of you might have seen the Chief Rabbi's comments in the Times a few days ago, chauvinisms and suspicions which currently exist on both sides will not be banished altogether, but will be substantially diminished.